Hi class! In this video we're going to be talking about an infant's social world and specifically about attachment. So, what is love between parents and children? I like to start this by going like, okay, well, what is this thing that we call love between parents and kids? And one of the things that I thought was really interesting is I found this quote by Abraham Lincoln who says, "Love is the chain whereby to bind a child to its parent." So he's saying that there's some sort of like connection, that chain between a child and their parent. And I think it's really a neat and nifty idea when we start to think about attachment. So I want us to get into a little history lesson. It was the 1920s, way older than me. During that time, Prohibition was present, but that didn't stop people from drinking. Betty White was born, and there was the invention of sliced bread. And just so you know, which is older, Betty White or sliced bread? Technically Betty White. And we have this guy here who was a big psychologist back in the 1920s. So does anybody know who that is? If you said John B. Watson, you'd be right. So John Watson, better known for his Little Albert study. If you don't know about that, go ahead and look up Little Albert. But at the time, he actually was a pretty big, like one of the first kind of like pop psychologists that we really have. He was doing a lot of good research. He was like very much so into behaviorism, but he also wrote books for the general public about parenting. And his thought was that love is just a reaction. So he's a very big behaviorist. So he just said, all that love is just a reaction. And if we have too much love, then we've just coddled our children and they can't grow up to be independent people. And this will just mess up everything when it comes to marriage. So just as an interesting quote from Watson, he said, "Let your behaviors always be objective and kindly firm. Never hug and kiss them. Never let them sit in your lap. If you must, kiss them once on the forehead when they say good night. Shake hands with them in the morning. Give them a pat on the head if they've made an extraordinarily good job of a difficult task." So this is how we should raise our kids, right? Well, while he was a pop psychologist and he was, giving these ideas, there was a lot of backlash at the time, both in the popular press and in psychology. They basically said, no, we don't need to just, pat our kids on the head and give them a shake. Instead, we have to really think about giving love and affection towards our children. And one of the things that happened was in the 1930s, we start to see problems of infants being in orphanages, that they're not getting enough love and affection. And this leads to something called failure to thrive, where an infant can actually die from the lack of that stimulation. So they just start kind of wasting away. Even if they're trying to eat, they will literally waste away. So we have to really think about these ideas and update them based on some other things that we see. So we go a little bit further, 1950s. Ritz crackers were invented and they only cost 32 cents. I Love Lucy was on the small screen, on the television screen. And the Golden Arches started. And we get this little lovely study done, which is Harry Harlow's monkey studies. And specifically, he starts to look at, well, what happens when we experimentally change who the mother is for these little infant monkeys? And are they going to fare better if their mother is feeding them, so is this just a nutrition thing, or if it's wrapped in terry cloth. Of course, my videos won't work because I still don't have power, but I will try to splice in here what this monkey experiment looks like. But one of the main things that come out of this study is that contact comfort, which is what this baby is doing here, where it's touching something soft and delicate, is much more effective as a parent than the wire cage, which is giving them nutrition. And so it's not just about nutrition. We really do have something about affection. And this gets us into John Bowlby. So John Bowlby takes these ideas and starts to look at the attachment between an infant and their parent. So attachment is just that emotional bond, and it's really about this emotional bond that's going to keep taking place even across time and space. So generally it's with an infant and their caregiver, right? So what he says is that we are biologically predisposed to develop attachments. And the reason for this is that it really helps us with our own survival. So he says that we can have these secure attachments where we actually are able to explore the world around us when we feel that love and trust with our caregiver. So having a secure base with an older and wiser person allows us to explore the world. And eventually that world generates some fear and anxiety. So you can see this with young infants, right? When they're in a new place, for example, and they want to play with a toy. So at first they may just kind of hang on to their parent or their caregiver, and wait until they're kind of like met emotionally. They go out, they explore, they start playing with that toy, but eventually they're going to feel a little bit more anxiety and they'll reach out back to that caregiver. So this might just be as simple as looking at the caregiver, making sure they're still there, caregiver's giving them a little nice nod, or it could be like actually coming back and getting a hug from their caregiver, and then they feel secure again and they can go explore the world. So attachment is really important for us to be able to explore in a safe environment and feel comforted by that caregiver. So how can we actually test how secure an infant is or a child is to their caregivers? And so Mary Ainsworth came along after Bowlby, took his ideas and said, hey, let's actually start testing this. And what they came up with was called the strange situation. And basically what this does is you put an infant in a strange situation. So here we have the caregiver and the infant. They come into a room, lots of fun toys, but it's new to them. The child is encouraged to explore. One of the things is that a stranger will come in. So how does that infant interact with that stranger when mom is around or when mom leaves? We also have separation anxiety. So is the child left alone? What do they do? So typically we see children don't like to be left alone and they get a lot of fear and anxiety. And so that's called separation anxiety. And so we look at, okay, well then what happens when the caregiver comes back? If the caregiver comes back and they have a nice little reunion and the infant is able to go back to playing, we would say, yeah, that's a secure attachment. So basically, distressed when the caregiver leaves, but then calm down when the caregiver returns. And what we see here is that there are 4 different types of attachment styles. So I'm going to actually jump to the second one, which is the secure attachment. The child plays happily when they're in the room together with mom. Mother leaves, or I should change this to be caregiver leaves. The child is pausing, not as happy, but when the caregiver returns, they return to play. Everything's okay. There's also insecure attachment styles. So we have this avoidant attachment style where basically the child is avoiding or ignoring their caregiver. So it's kind of like, the child is continuing to play when the caregiver leaves and ignores the caregiver. We also have our ambivalent, resistant or ambivalent children who are basically preoccupied with their caregiver, maybe really unhappy when the caregiver leaves, but also isn't really happy when they come back. They may be really angry. How dare you do this to me? And lastly, there's disorganized. The child is really cautious around their parent. They're not sure what to expect and may act oddly. We'll have you watch this strange situation video so you can see how the children are reacting. Now, you might be saying, okay, well, so the children are acting differently, but why? Well, some of it might be how the caregiver is reacting. So what are the behaviors that the caregiver is showing? So in a secure attachment, we see a lot of responsive parenting. The parents will respond to the infant's needs. In more of an insecure avoidant, the parent may be unavailable, rejecting. And resistant ambivalent one could be inconsistent, and disorganized, there might be a potential for physical or mental abuse, as well as depressed parents will sometimes have children with disorganized attachment. Oops. So one of the good things to hear is that most children are going to develop a secure attachment with their caregivers. And secure attachment is actually really great. Children who are securely attached will show better social adjustment and have better social skills. Part of that might be that they know that they are loved and taken care of by their caregiver. And this now means that they can go into their new relationships, like peer relationships, and be able to say, hey, I'm confident that I'm going to get what I need out of this relationship. And so these children really do seem to have a lot of good emotional expression, use good communication skills too. So I have this little review for you to go over and kind of test yourself on these different concepts. And we can go over that in class. So don't forget your quiz for infancy is due Friday at midnight, and on Wednesday's class we'll move into early childhood. I hope to see you then. Bye.